Hello and welcome from the Center for Livable Cities, and a warm welcome to the fourth episode in our CLC webinar series, Cities Adapting to a Disrupted World. I'm your host, Dinesh Naidu. Today's webinar is co-organized with Connected Places Catapult and is titled Glasgow, Leading the UK's Net Zero Carbon Agenda. But first, some housekeeping. Simultaneous interpretation in Mandarin is available for this webinar. To access this, please click on the Interpretation tab on your Zoom toolbar and then select Chinese. Today's webinar will be conducted in a new format. Professor Greg Clark, Chairman of Connected Places Catapult, and Councillor Susan Aitken, the leader of the Glasgow City Council, will have a fireside chat on climate change and how Glasgow is decarbonizing its economy and infrastructure. We've received questions for Professor Clark and Councillor Aitken during registration, and you can also post questions to them using the Q&A tab. Now honored to welcome and introduce our speakers. Professor Greg Clark, CBE, is Chairman of Connected Places Catapult and a renowned global expert on cities and urban innovation. He's also the Group Global Head for Future Cities and New Industries at HSBC. Last but definitely not least, he is a close friend of the Center for Livable Cities as the longtime moderator of our World City Summit Mayors Forum. Our distinguished speaker today is Councillor Susan Aitken. Councillor Aitken has been leader of Glasgow City Council since May 2017 and councillor for the Langside ward where she lives since 2012. She has been leader of the Scottish National Party group since 2014, as also the party's national local government convener. Councillor Susan launched the Sustainable Glasgow Partnership to mobilize the city chiefs from all sectors to lead Glasgow's race to carbon net zero by 2040, and we are excited to hear about these plans. Without further ado, Professor Greg Clark and Councillor Susan Aitken, the mics are yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dinesh. Good morning to everyone from London and from Glasgow. Good afternoon to everyone in Singapore and greetings to everyone around the world. It's a great pleasure for me to host this conversation with the inspiring Councillor Susan Aitken. More than 800 people have registered from 51 different countries. I want to say welcome to all of you. And I want to say a very particular and warm good morning. Thank you for joining us, and it's great to have you here, Susan. Let me also thank quickly the Centre for Livable Cities and the Connected Places Catapult, who've worked together to bring this conversation to happen this morning. Thank you to everyone involved. Susan, with your blessing, shall we get started?
Yes, absolutely, Greg.
Great. Well, Susan, firstly, thank you again for joining us. Let's talk immediately about COP26. What will happen when COP26 comes to Glasgow and you host the world? And what does it mean to Glasgow to be doing that?
Well, first of all, can I just say it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to the Centre for Sustainable Cities for inviting me to this event. It's a real honour. What it means to host COP26, it's extraordinary in many ways. Glasgow is perhaps I think for many people might have been a little bit of a surprise choice. When the UK was chosen as the host, I think perhaps people assumed that COP26 would be hosted in London. Obviously one of the world's great global cities, one of the mega cities of the world. Glasgow perhaps would have been seen as a left field choice for many people, but we weren't surprised because over the past maybe 10 to 15 years in particular, but really the past 30 years, Glasgow has become a world-class host of events. We hosted the Commonwealth Games in 2014 and European Championships and multi-sport championships in 2018, just to name a couple. And we're very, very good at it. And it's something that we've used to drive the regeneration of, we are a post-industrial city moving into becoming a knowledge and innovation city, but we've used events and tourism and culture to drive our renaissance as a city over the past 30 years. So we know that we are going to put on a really, really good event, and that the people who come to COP26, albeit post-COVID, or we hope by next November, we will be in a post-COVID situation, but still very much in the context of that global pandemic. It will be a bit different from previous COPs, but people will have an incredible experience, and they will get a real sense of the city of Glasgow when they're there. What it means to us as a city in terms of our zero carbon ambitions, our net zero ambitions for 2030, which are very ambitious, particularly for a city which has the challenges, the physical challenges that we do as a post-industrial city, is that it will really help us to accelerate and to concentrate minds. What we want to do is make Glasgow an example, a demonstrator city for the world, which shows that no matter how big you think your barriers are to achieving net zero, to reducing your carbon emissions really at a considerable pace and in big steps, and nothing is insurmountable. If Glasgow can do it, then any city can do it. The way that our city is built, the physical legacy of our past does give us many challenges, but those challenges also provide us with inspiration to innovate and to do this. And I think finally we would say that Glasgow is a city that is rooted in social justice. Last year, the New York Times, in a profile of Glasgow, described us as humane, political, and refusenik. And those three words are going to be really, really important. That social justice and climate justice for us go hand in hand. Social justice for our own citizens who were left behind the last time our heavy industries went into decline, and we still live with the social challenges that happened then, that resulted from that. But social justice also for citizens of the world, and particularly people living in the global south who are suffering loss and damage from climate change right now. Glasgow has always seen ourselves as a great international city. We were one of the first cities in the world to give freedom of the city to Nelson Mandela, for example. We see ourselves as an international citizen. So this is not just important for us as a city, this is about Glasgow playing our part as a responsible and an active global citizen on the big issue of our times.
Susan, thank you very much. I mean, there's so many interesting things that you've said about Glasgow, but I love this combination of being humane, political, and refusenik. And of course, the warmth of the welcome is going to be incredible. For anybody who's never visited Glasgow, you will be hard to find a city where the welcome will be warmer. Let's talk then about how you're using COP26 to accelerate your own decarbonisation path. How does hosting the world help you to do it locally?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I'm not sure, I can't see you, by the way, Greg. I'm not sure if everyone else is in that position. But there's a number of things. I think, first of all, it concentrates minds. Both at home and around the world. It concentrates minds on the task in hand. We have given ourselves an enormous task, now 10 years, to reach net zero. You know, we're under no illusion about the scale of the challenge that we've given ourselves, but we do think that that ambition is absolutely the right level of ambition to set. But you know, hosting in now just over a year's time the most important climate event since the Paris Agreement, and the event that will determine whether the world, in the shape of national governments, are actually going to make the necessary decisions and commit the necessary resources to make the Paris Agreement a reality, and really start to deliver on those commitments to stop the heating up of the world and reduce emissions. We all have to think, okay, this is really real now. This is not something that's abstract or hypothetical. And as the host city, that is even more the case. It's absolutely the case that this is real. We can't ignore this now. It's not something that we can just talk about. So it concentrates our minds. It allows us to accelerate our existing plans. We had lots of plans and ideas for carbon reduction before we were named as the host city for COP26. But if we are serious about being that demonstrator city, about when the world comes to Glasgow, that they will be able to see what's possible in a city and how a city can lead the way, then we really have to accelerate. We have to get moving, and we have to make sure that some of those plans become reality by November next year. If I'm going to be candid, I would say that it gives us some leverage with national governments, particularly the UK national government. As the host nation for COP26, it's in the UK government's interest to make sure that the host city is putting on a good show, and that the UK itself is showing that it's moving towards and living up to its own climate targets, and that it's setting the pace for the world. So that allows us to say to the UK government, you need to start putting your money where your mouth is here, and where else to start doing it but in the city that the world's going to be coming to, that's going to be hosting COP26. So we will be using that leverage with our colleagues in UK government, who obviously have a far bigger scale of resource than we do as a city. And finally, I would say, I think the opportunity for partnerships, for learning, for exchange of knowledge, for learning from other cities in the world. Although we're ahead of the game in the sense of the UK, we're not really ahead of the game in comparison to many other cities. And in Asia, for example, there are many cities are considerably further ahead on employing smart technology, for example. We are really good at that in Glasgow in the context of the UK and even Europe. But there are other parts of the world, other continents who are way ahead. So we need to learn from them, and the opportunities to have events like today to exchange knowledge and for us to soak in that knowledge and learn and apply that to our own plans is absolutely invaluable. And without COP26, I don't think we would have as many opportunities as we do have. So it's incredibly important for us.
Susan, thank you very much. By the way, I'm reassured that the audience can see us both. So hopefully
good.
You'll be able to...
I can see you now, actually. You've just
great.
appeared
Well,
on my screen. That's good.
So you've talked a lot here about COP26 acting as an acceleration device. It's giving you leverage with national audiences, but it's also giving you visibility globally, which is obviously fantastic. And of course, the Connected Places Catapult and the Energy Systems Catapult are working with you as well. And we're really grateful for the chance to work with Glasgow to produce this accelerated decarbonisation plan. But let me ask you the obvious question. Has COVID-19 and what's happening, especially now with the increased lockdowns that are happening in Scotland, has COVID-19 made your task easier, or has it made it harder? And in what ways?
Well, both is the answer. It has made it harder because a lot of what we have to do in Glasgow is around the physical transformation of the city. So it's about green infrastructure. It's about changing our housing stock, for example, which I'll come on to say a bit more about because that's a particularly big issue for us. It's about changing the way that our streets are configured and our neighbourhoods are configured. So the shutdown, the lockdown on construction that happened in the UK and in Scotland for a period there, undoubtedly it slowed us down. And you know, all of the lockdown, which we are emerging from, we've just taken a little bit of a step back in Scotland, actually just announced yesterday, and from tomorrow, not a full lockdown, but we've added some more restrictions just for a temporary period. Yes, it's meant that COVID has been our top priority as a city, and obviously it's been the top priority of both the Scottish government at national level and the UK government at supranational level as well. On the other hand, though, again, it has encapsulated for us, I think not just in Glasgow but across the world, the need for, when we drive that economic recovery from this global pandemic, it must be a sustainable recovery. It must be a recovery that is rooted in carbon reduction. It must be a green recovery. And also at the heart of that, it must have public health at its centre. You know, in the past, and Glasgow I could talk a long time about how Glasgow has had an economy that hasn't encouraged health. It has damaged the health of too many people for too long, and that in turn has then had a circular impact on the economy. So we need an economy that it promotes health, is salutogenic, I believe is the phrase that the public health experts use, rather than health detracting, it's health creating. And that means it has to be sustainable, because we know that high carbon economy is damaging to health. So all of those things now come together: sustainability, public health, social justice, and that economic recovery from COVID. So again, it has done that thing of concentrating minds. And I suppose it has given us a little bit of space, breathing space, to think about what it is that we need to do, what we need to prioritise, both in terms of investment of our resources, but also what we do first, what we're going to get the biggest outcome from, in terms of those big steps in carbon reduction that we're going to have to take to get to net zero in 2030. This can't be just tinkering around the edges. It's got to be the big impact projects that we deliver as quickly as possible.
Great, Susan, thank you very much. I want to come on to ask you a little bit more about all of this, because these links between human health, planetary health, economic prosperity, they're very, very interesting questions. But just before we do that, let's have a look at the poll that was set for our 800-person audience before we began. One of the questions that was asked is, what are the top 3 barriers to pursuing net zero carbon in cities? And let's see what they had to say. So people were allowed to vote more than once. And as you can see, that the top result here is embedded behaviours and infrastructures. 52% of people listed that. Not far behind, 49%, the investment requirements. How do we afford it? 48% lack of leadership. And obviously that's what you're here to talk about. And we've already heard quite a lot from you about the kind of leadership that's needed. Lack of demand and incentives scores quite high, weak regulation as well. And then the others. But citizen apathy is not highly scored, and nor is insufficient technology. And actually fragmented organizations not highly scored either. So it seems that where we are is about embedded behaviors, the investment requirements, lack of demand or incentives. Does that ring true to you? Is that how you see the challenges?
Yes, I think that's very fair, and I would say that the embedded behaviours and the leadership issue are absolutely entwined. Undoubtedly, Glasgow, to give a personal example, but this will apply to many cities in the world. Glasgow is a city that has been very much structured around car use. Despite the fact that in actual fact we have the lowest car ownership of any city in the UK, just over 50% of our population don't own a car, but nonetheless our entire city centre has been designed for people to drive in and out of the city, and as a result we have some of the worst, or we've improved it considerably over the past couple of years, but we had some of the worst air quality of any city outside of London in the UK. But that's one example. People get very used to being able to drive and the convenience of that. And even though we would say, actually, it only affects a minority of people in the city, it's something that people want to hold on to. And when you challenge that culture, there's a big backlash. The motoring lobby, for want of a better term, is a very, very strong and very vocal one. And it's very easy for a political leader like me, someone who's up for re-election in a couple of years, to go, do you know what, that's too difficult. I don't want to have that fight. It's too hard. But if I don't have that fight and I don't take it on, and it isn't about a fight, it has to be about making the case, it's about evidence, it's about persuasion. But nonetheless, that is a challenge. So it does require courage in leadership, and it requires a willingness to, that phrase, choose the hill to die on, if you like, to say, okay, if you're in politics for any reason, it's to achieve something and actually deliver something, and if you make sacrifices in the meantime, then so be it, because I certainly don't want to come to the end of my first term as leader of the city and not have made some of those difficult decisions. So those are very closely tied together, I would say. And I would also agree entirely that lack of technology is not the issue. The technology is there. It is about the willingness to invest and to employ that technology, and also to disinvest where in high carbon interventions and high carbon economic activity, and invest where we know we can make the difference.
Susan, thank you very much. What you're saying is actually really inspiring. And I know you have a reputation for bravery, and maybe on another day we'll ask you where the bravery comes from. We're going to keep going though with a few questions because we want to involve our audience in a minute. So we probably have to speed up just a little bit. Now, the Connected Places Catapult and the Centre for Livable Cities are partly hosting this event because we're very interested in the link between reducing carbon and improving livability. How do you see one helping the other? What's the link for you here?
I think there's a whole number of ways, perhaps just to pick on a couple. I've touched already on the issue of traffic and private cars in particular. I think the active travel, the ability to walk, to cycle, to move around in urban places safely and again in a healthy environment is absolutely part of livability, is absolutely crucial. So reducing the amount of private traffic on our roads, and in some cases removing private traffic from our roads where that's appropriate and necessary, I think that absolutely contributes to livability. And certainly in Glasgow, its transport is the biggest source of emissions. So that direct link between decarbonisation and improved livability there. Another big issue for us is what we call affordable warmth. So improving the energy efficiency of housing, and particularly our older housing stock in the city. We have a significant number of people who live in the city, just under a third of our population in what we call fuel poverty, where they're having to spend far too much of their income simply on heating their homes. And I say this in early October in a country that is not a warm country and is a wet country. So again, that investment in energy efficient homes also is an investment in people's well-being and health and in livability. And vacant and derelict land is another big issue for us. As a post-industrial city, we've got the highest amount of vacant and derelict land of any city in the UK. Transforming that land, and the poorer you are, the more likely you are to live next to a blight of vacant and derelict land. Transforming that land into green space or into new communities, low carbon communities, or low carbon employment opportunities, all of those transformation opportunities all help us to decarbonise and at the same time just improve the look, feel and well-being of the city and our citizens.
I mean, this is very fascinating, Susan, because in a sense you're painting a picture of the challenges of the post-industrial city, the physical legacy, the environmental outcomes, some of the social issues that arise. And of course, Glasgow is famous for this kind of post-industrial recovery, this amazing journey that the city's been on. So tell us a little bit about the kind of business and jobs end of this. Does the pursuit of a zero carbon agenda actually create job opportunities and create new opportunities for business and enterprise as you see it?
I think it has to. I think we have an absolute responsibility to make sure that it does. And I go back to a point that I alluded to earlier. When Glasgow's heavy industry, Glasgow was the workshop of the world in the 19th century and the early 20th century. We were known as the shipbuilder of the world, the engineer of the world. But when that heavy industry declined, there was no plan in place to help the primarily at that time male workforce transition into new jobs and new roles, and entire communities were left behind. And we still live with that legacy today, the social legacy of that in Glasgow. And it was devastating. It's why Glasgow has had to go through that recovery and renaissance. We can't allow that to happen again. We know that some of our current industry and economic activity is going to become obsolete if we are serious about moving to a low carbon economy and a low carbon world. So we have to prepare now to make sure that decarbonisation means new jobs, and to equip people with the skills to access those new jobs, and make sure that people have the pathways, so the people who are transitioning out of old industries have the pathways into the new industries. I think that's actually a moral responsibility for governments, both at national and local level and city level, like me. I think the opportunities, though, are fantastic. I've touched on one already, a big one for Glasgow, which is retrofitting existing housing stock. A huge amount. We have 70,000 people in Glasgow live in what we call pre-1919 tenements, which is our indigenous vernacular architectural style. It's horrendously energy inefficient, but it's also, it defines the city. It's a lot of it you can see on the backdrop behind me. We don't want to lose it. We don't want to bulldoze that and replace it with something else. We wouldn't be Glasgow anymore. So we have to retrofit it. We have to make it energy efficient. We have to make it low carbon. And that's a huge task. And we need skills and jobs in order to do that. So that's just one example. There's green tech, renewables, renewable energy. There are enormous opportunities here. It's making sure that we align and make sure that the people who need it most are able to access those opportunities, and that we don't have generations left behind again, as we did in the post-war period when heavy industry started to decline and then disappear.
So, Susan, in a way, you're saying that a zero carbon pathway is not just an agenda for frugality, it's actually a way of creating new kinds of prosperity. Let's have a look at the second poll, if we may, that was undertaken just before we came on air, where Centre for Livable Cities and the Connected Places Catapult wanted to ask people, what are the additional benefits of pursuing a net zero carbon strategy in city? And you can see 75% of them said it's health and clean air. As you've already said, Susan, climate change makes you sick. And if you can do something about carbon, you can really improve quality of life. You can see 68% said livability and population growth, the thing you've just been talking about. 54% said resilience. You've just been talking about that as well. Economic resilience, diversification of the economy, improving the quality of people's homes. Anything there that strikes you as interesting? I see quite low scores on financial savings, even though perhaps we do expect to see savings from this net zero carbon. What's your view, Susan?
I think we may well see savings, but I think it might be a little while before we see them. We're going to have to invest first, perhaps, before we see those savings come. The savings are maybe slightly further down the road. Having said that, I don't think they're decades down the road. I think, you know, we'll see them in perhaps 10 years' time. We really could start to see a difference for, and you know, again, for municipal budgets at city and local government level. I think that is something that we look forward to. But I think it definitely shouldn't be our motivation. Because we're not going to realise it overnight, and because there are much more pressing reasons to be doing this. But otherwise, I would largely agree again with the things that people have prioritised there. Clean air and public health, and I know obviously you know, Centre for Livable Cities is in Singapore, and for many large Asian cities, clean air is a particular issue and something that's very high on their agenda. And I've already indicated that that's a big one for Glasgow as well. We estimate that around 300 people a year in the city of Glasgow die directly as a result of air pollution, which is an appalling waste of human life and human opportunity. So yes, it's absolutely right that that's seen as a very high priority. People across the world are dying now or experiencing chronic ill health now because of climate change. So that has to be the motivator for us to tackle it.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I want to bring in the delegates at the event soon. So maybe you and I will do 3 more questions if that suits you, and then we'll flip over and see what other people want to say. Let's pick up the theme of technology, because you've already said there's no dearth of technology here. And of course, Glasgow's great history as a city of invention and discovery is part of the backdrop to this. So do you think there will be new inventions, new innovations, new discoveries coming out of this journey to net zero?
Undoubtedly, and I'm not enough of an expert to say exactly what those are, but you know, again, to use our housing example, we're working in a partnership with the University of Glasgow and with one of our community-led housing associations in the city to retrofit one of those pre-1919 tenements that I was talking about, and the structure is we call it a close, a stairway with 2 apartments on either side. So there are 8 apartments, and each one there's a different approach being taken. So it's empty. They're all empty. We bought out the flats and so that we could have an entire building to work on and experiment on. And there's a slightly different approach being taken in each one. We're aiming for passive house standard, which is, as I'm sure the audience will know, is the kind of top standard for energy efficiency in homes. But we don't know exactly what the best method is going to be. And as a result of that, we'll discover which are the right building technologies that we need to not just get energy efficiency, but get energy efficiency at scale in Glasgow across 70,000 homes. So that's just one example. But I think innovation is going to be what gets us to net zero. It is going to be those innovative minds, whether in tech or modern manufacturing, engineering, nanotech. All of those things are going to be what gets us to where we need to be. And Glasgow is, again, perhaps not up where some other cities in the world are, but we're catching up as a city of innovation. We have 2 innovation districts in the city clustered around 2 of our universities, and the new Advanced Manufacturing Innovation District for Scotland, which is located just outside the city boundary. And their focus is going to be on green technology, on zero carbon, I think, overwhelmingly in the coming years.
Great, Susan, thank you very much. So let's talk about the people of Glasgow again, because your leadership task here is really interesting. You lead a very proud city, a city with a very strong community spirit, a very strong identity. How are you engaging the people of Glasgow, both in the hosting of COP26, but also in this, you know, ambitious and inspiring zero carbon pathway? What's their role, and how do you get them to do it?
That's a very good question. Glaswegians, we have a Scottish word which is thrawn, T-H-R-A-W-N, which is kind of, it's hard to define in one word, but it's sort of close to stubborn, if you like, but proud, and, you know, they don't like to take lessons from anyone, don't like to be told what to do. Glaswegians are thrawn through and through. They're like kind of, they do not like to be told that someone knows better than them about anything. And if you tell people that they have to do something, there's every chance that they'll tell you to get lost. So we need to have Glaswegians lead the way on this. And I think what we've seen across the world, in fact, is that young people are already leading the way. We've had the school climate strikes in Glasgow, as we've seen across the globe, and young people and children from all sorts of backgrounds, not just privileged young people, are leading the way. One of our primary schools in the East End of Glasgow, which is one of the most deprived parts of the city, or people are living in poverty, but one of our primary schools in particular has done a huge campaign around single-use plastics, and in actual fact we in the council changed our policy as a result of their lobbying of us. So first and foremost, our school children and students are going to be put front and centre in this, because their parents are more likely to listen to them than they are to someone like me, a politician, telling them what to do. I think what I've already alluded to, this message about social justice, improving lives, improving places, it's not there's no point in hectoring people, and I also think I'm very uncomfortable with telling people living in poverty that they have to change their lifestyles. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think the way to bring those people with us is to say, we're working to improve your life, and we will deliver better outcomes for you, your household, your family, and your future, better life opportunities as a result of doing this. So it's making really clear those messages. That this is not something that we're making you do, and it's not, we're not asking you to sacrifice something here. We're asking you to join us in a journey that will actually result in a better city and better places for everyone. We're planning to do a big year to go launch for COP26 shortly, and there will be a lot of focus around citizens panels, not just citywide, but in our communities, in our neighbourhoods, where we will say to people, okay, we want to invest. How do you want us to invest in your neighbourhood locally? What's the difference that you need made for you in this journey to net zero? So some of our communities suffer quite a lot from flooding impact, for example. So I think they'll come back and say to us, we need that sorted, we need that fixed. Great, that's what we'll focus on for this particular community. So we need to put our citizens in charge. We need to make sure that they're leading the way, and that the politicians, not just politicians, but industry, business, everyone who's involved in this partnership to deliver change is listening to our citizens and following their lead. And then I think that there's some of the tougher messages about lifestyle change, about saying, actually, you are going to have to get out your car and you are going to have to recycle more. And all of those things are going to be easier to deliver, and easier if we're delivering those in partnership rather than from the top down.
Susan, thank you so much. Lots of people are interested in what you've just been saying. And by the way, we've stimulated about 40 questions from the audience now. So I'm going to be very quick. I want to ask you two things to round this bit off. One, how will Glasgow look and feel different as a result of this? What will people notice when they walk around the streets, or they ride the public transport, or they visit the city's hugely impressive galleries, museums, restaurants and bars? How will it feel different?
I think it will feel safer. It will feel like people can cross roads without being worried about very heavy traffic. It will feel much less congested. It will feel that places are designed for people rather than around traffic and cars. Public transport should be much more accessible. The opportunity to cycle and to walk will feel like a natural choice rather than something that you have to make an active decision to make in the face of barriers. It will feel like the natural thing to do. The air will be cleaner, and I think it will be a city that will feel more welcoming and more vibrant as a result. That's what we're aiming for, and I think we can turn that around pretty quickly. And you asked earlier about COVID, and it would be my final point before we go on to the questions from the audience. One area where we have used COVID as a real catalyst for quick change is what we call our Spaces for People programme. And this was helped by the Scottish Government, who really reduced all the regulation that was in place and all the legalities around changing the use of physical space in the city. So Glasgow had an issue where we had huge amounts of space given over to parking. for cars to just sit static, basically, so wasted space in a lot of ways. We've moved very, very quickly to turn that into widened pavements, into cycle lanes, into spaces for hospitality, to move outdoors, all of that. We hope to make that a permanent shift. We've done that in the space of 6 months. If we can do that in 6 months in response to a global pandemic and a public health emergency, then we can also do it in response to a climate and ecological emergency, which has been with us for a lot longer than 6 months.
Fantastic. So COVID is also a catalyst for what you need to do here. And Susan, wonderful remarks. I do want to ask you, where does the motivation for you come here? We will get to the questions in a minute, but what is it that gets you out of bed in the morning, and where do you find this amazing courage that you're exhibiting?
I think I'm relatively recent as a politician. I haven't been a politician for all that long, although I've been a political activist for all of my adult life. I hadn't necessarily expected or planned to end up in a position like this. And also, there was a big political change in Glasgow when I became leader of the council. There hadn't been a change in administration for 40 years. So my party was given this opportunity, and I think we don't take it for granted. We understand we could lose all this again at the next election. So if we've got this window of space to do something, then I really want to do something. I want to demonstrate. I don't want to have wasted this time. If it's only 5 years in this job, I do not want to have wasted this time. And climate change, the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, these are the issues. These are the issues that we have to respond to. And we don't have time to mess around. So I'm kind of like, this wasn't expected, so if it goes again, it's not the end of the world. But if it goes and I haven't actually got something to show for it, both personally and most of all for the city, for the people who elected me and my colleagues, then I think that's not something I would particularly want to have to think about for the rest of my life. So I sort of feel I've got nothing to lose, and the city and indeed beyond have a lot to gain if we show this courage and we don't allow political nervousness to stand in the way of change.
Great sense of destiny I feel coming here. Let's go immediately to what our audience want to talk to us about. Some people have already submitted questions, which I think some have been selected. We'll hear from some of those now. We'll do short questions, short answers, and then we'll get into the now 34 questions that are waiting in the chat box. So Dinesh and colleagues, tell us who's first. So here we have a question from Kate Pangborn. This is an important point to raise. I haven't heard much about transport yet. I'd like to know more about how decarbonisation of mobility and accessibility are being addressed in a socially just manner in Glasgow and the wider region, to touch on the boundary question. What about transport, Susan?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it is absolutely central to what we're doing. I've already said that Glaswegians, most Glaswegians don't own cars. About 51% of our households don't own cars. So public transport and accessibility to public transport is an absolutely crucial social justice issue for Glasgow and indeed the wider metropolitan region. Actually, before we knew we were going to be the host city for COP26, one of the first things that I did as leader of the council was commission a plan about, we called it the Connectivity Commission. I put together a panel of experts who produced a plan for us around transformation of access to transport, particularly for our poorest citizens. So we've already started putting that in place around buses, particularly is our first focus. Working with the bus companies, we don't have municipal bus companies in Glasgow. That's perhaps a longer term ambition, but right now we need to work with what we've got. So working with the bus companies, first of all, to decarbonise their fleet. the fleet in Glasgow had not had investment in it for a long, long time. It was dirty, frankly. So we've got them to invest in considerable improvements in their fleet. In return, we in the city are changing space, creating green lanes, making sure that bus journeys are faster and are more accessible for people. We've still got some work to do on routes and on connecting up parts of the city that aren't well connected just now. That's a very big priority for us. But we're also working with the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland, the national transport body, on a plan for a Glasgow Metro. Which I think would be the biggest piece of transport infrastructure in Scotland for decades, certainly in the west of Scotland, public transport infrastructure investment. So we're working towards that announcement being made in the next strategic transport projects review for Scotland, which will probably be towards the end of next year. But we're working on the feasibility for that just now. Plans are well advanced to connect up that wider city region, to connect people to each other, to jobs, crucially, to employment opportunities, and to these new low carbon employment opportunities that I was talking about earlier, most of all. So I don't have the time to go into the detail of that, but I'd be happy to share with any delegates some more detail about our Connectivity Commission plan, and particularly about the Glasgow Metro.
Susan, we're getting a lot of very warm reactions to what you're saying, and various people asking if they can have you as their city leader, please. So I guess that's an invitation for them to move to Glasgow. Let's take the next question that was submitted earlier on. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is a question from Vladimir Luis. Just read the Vladimir Luis Beale. How has the population's acceptance of zero carbon emissions policy been? Have there been any resistances? Well, you've already talked about the thrawn and perhaps the gallus nature of the people of Glasgow. What's really worked in regard to this, Susan?
I think the housing has been a particular success for us in Glasgow over a long number of years, a long number of decades. We're not a landlord in the city, but we are the Strategic Housing Authority. We have a network of over 80 community-led housing associations in our neighbourhoods, and working with them, we are building energy efficient, low carbon housing, and that is something, because these housing associations are led by the tenants, they're led by the residents themselves. That's something that our own people are leading the way on, and it's been an enormous success for us. And in actual fact, we're planning, there's a part of the north of the city which has been quite neglected for a long time, and we have a master plan to build 3,000 new passive house homes, some social rented, affordable homes, some for purchase, a mixed tenure community there, and that's really led by local people in their role as leading their own local housing organisations. So that's been a big success for us. But there have been resistances, and there will be undoubtedly. In fact, just in our local paper today, there's some local politicians complaining. We are reducing the number of waste collections in order the general waste, in order to try and get people to put less stuff in general waste and recycle more. And lo and behold, there's some politicians kicking back against that today, and bizarrely arguing that people should have the right to just continue to throw away whatever they want. People shouldn't have the right to just continue to throw away whatever they want. We all have a responsibility to put less stuff in our bins and to recycle more. So yes, those resistances are still there, and we're going to have to keep pushing.
Thank you very much, Susan. It always comes down to bins in the end, doesn't it? It's funny.
It does, especially in local government. It's always the bins.
It's always the bins. Let's take one more question from those that were pre-prepared. People submitted them when they registered for the event. Can we take the next one, please? What are the key strategies to achieve net zero carbon on a town-wide level? This is from Tan Si Nin in Singapore. You've already commented on this, Susan. Maybe you just want to summarize what you think are the key strategies you have to integrate. And of course, this is where the Connected Places Catapult and the Energy Systems Catapult are working with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big areas of focus are domestic heat, and I've already touched on that. Transport, so those are our two biggest sources of emissions, domestic heat and transport as our big targets for decarbonisation, greening the city. Glasgow, in Scots Gaelic, Glasgow means green place, and we have a huge amount of urban green space, parkland in the city, but we also have our city centre in particular is not very green at all. So that vacant and derelict land that I talked about earlier, greening the city, creating space for food growing, for example, using that land in a way that is much more focused on carbon reduction than it would have been in the past. And also green infrastructure. We've got a big focus in partnership with the Scottish Government in using our river, the River Clyde, which in the past was a source of carbon emissions. The Clyde was the site of that being the workshop of the world of the Industrial Revolution in Glasgow. But now we're looking at that as the source of clean, renewable energy, heat from the river. So we are working with the Scottish Government. They've committed an initial £25 million to start investigating heat projects right along, not just in the city of Glasgow, but an 80-mile corridor of the river to start on that work and exploit those natural assets that we have as a city as well. All of that underpinned by that citizen engagement, community-led feeling that I talked about earlier, which is going to be essential to take our people with us.
Susan, thank you so much. Now I'm getting cues that we have to wind up to get into the final stage. And I know that you're going to stay for a couple of minutes to look at some of the Q&A questions afterwards. So I'm going to hand back to Dinesh in a moment to ask him to tell us where we go next with this. But I just want to say more personally to you that it's been really inspiring listening to what you had to say today. Of course, I'm lucky enough to have seen your leadership in the city over the past 3 or 4 years. And I think that the city has so much momentum at the moment. It's really exciting to see the zero carbon agenda emerging as the next stage in Glasgow's great renaissance. So thank you for the leadership that you're bringing to all of that. And myself and other people around the world really appreciate it. Dinesh, back to you to tell us what happens next.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you, Professor Greg Clark and Councillor Susan Aitken, for that thoughtful and really inspiring discussion about what cities can do in the fight against the climate emergency. Thank you both for your time with us today. Our next webinar will be in 2 weeks on the 22nd of October, entitled Living with Diversity, Religious Harmony in Singapore, co-organized with the Institute of Policy Studies. Professor Yaacob Ibrahim, a former cabinet minister in Singapore, will join Professor Lily Kong, the president of the Singapore Management University, to discuss the changing nature of religion and its implications for managing religious groups, spaces, and relations in cities. Dr. Matthew Matthews, the head of the Social Lab and Senior Research Fellow at the National University of Singapore's Institute of Policy Studies, will be our guest moderator. We are also happy to launch our latest Urban System Studies book on religious harmony in Singapore, spaces, practices, and communities at this webinar. Please register to attend using the QR code or the link. This webinar has been live streamed on CLC's Facebook page, and we'll upload a recording of it tomorrow on our CLC YouTube channel, where you can find almost 600 other videos, including this one on Scotland's transition to a low carbon economy. Finally, thank you to you, dear viewers, for your participation. We hope you find these webinars useful. Before you leave, please use the QR code or link to fill in the feedback form. Do tell us what works and how we can do better. We've come to the end of today's webinar, but we will be leaving this room open for another 5 minutes. Councillor Aitken and Professor Clark told me that they might be able to stay back for a few minutes to exchange messages with members of the audience, so feel free to continue the conversation there. Until our next webinar on the 22nd of October, goodbye and stay healthy.